$2,500 per person, which goes to show you the amount of money that's there versus the amount of money that's here. There are 350 million people here. There are 120 million people in Nigeria. So the investment potential of bringing 2 or 3 or even 4 billion people into a modern standard of living and providing them with goods and services and phones, there is so much pent-up economic potential in monetary reform that I don't even, I might guess it would probably be 20 years before we even see a leveling off, because it's that much work to be done.
I would like to address the question from the standpoint of the NEED Act. And the question was basically, will there be credit for people if we enact monetary reform? And yes, there will. One of the key points of the NEED Act is a citizen's dividend, which should be substantial. The exact amount was not put into the legislation, but that would be determined by Congress. And the figure a lot of us thought about, and this was Stephen Zarlinga's figure, was $10,000 for every person in the country. And this would be a citizen's dividend, or we could refer to it as a citizen's bailout, because the 90%, 99%, whatever, of us have been tremendously hurt by the present monetary system. And giving us that money, which would be about 3.2 or 3.3 trillion dollars, people would have to do something with it then. And many would pay off debts to some extent, and other people would want to
Wait a little bit.
okay. Other people would want to put it into a bank, but they would want to put it into a bank, not in. The banks would have safekeeping accounts in the NEED Act where that money was never touched. The bank was just keeping it for you. But if you wanted to make a deal with the bank, and maybe they could loan that money out and you would split the interest or whatever. So it would be a way for people to invest their wealth as all of us start to benefit from this country and actually gain wealth. We could then invest it and other people could borrow it. So I don't think there'll be any shortage, and the NEED Act also has provisions for the Federal Reserve to make funds available for banks if there's a need for that. So I think there'll be plenty of money for investment, for loans under the NEED Act. Thank you.
I would like to add something to that, and that is that that it's all well and good to talk about the additional power that people will have economically because of this distribution of wealth. The NEED Act sends sums to the states as well as to the, as suggesting at least that the citizens' dividends occur. But it seems to me that we'll have to keep in mind that all of government expenditure, no matter if you pass the NEED Act or not, is still in the hands of the federal legislature. So there will be a need for concern about fiscal policy even after the implementation of a monetary reform. Still, the government is going to have something to say about whether that money goes to education or whether it goes here or there or minority programs or whatever. So it's not, I think it's easy to say that, well, this is a magic solution, this monetary thing, and the NEED Act's going to cure everything. I don't think it will.
Yeah, to that point, Michael Kumhoff says the NEED Act or the Chicago Plan is not a Christmas tree where you can find everything underneath it. I think Yamaguchi, though, makes a key point here, and it prevents inflation, which would be one of the concerns here. You can have like a social dividend, and as I described earlier in Maryland, it worked. How much can you put out there or into a social dividend and keep credit flowing or keep the system working? But Yamaguchi makes the point of the GDP gap. And you can look at underemployment, unemployment, misaligned employment, where the person's not at their potential. If you can get people really being in tune with their motivations and finding their natural strengths and gaining employment in those ways, the government can create the money to put people to work at all times. And that won't be inflationary. And then, so when you have more people working in all around the world, as Mark would want to point here, too, you have a lot of people with some excess income, and they can put it in their depositories, banks, or whatever, or at pensions for 45 years, et cetera, and others can get that money for homes or investments, and you can take the level of risk you want. You want high risk, you want to make a big interest rate, you can back credit cards. If you want a medium interest rate, you can have your money in a savings account backing mortgages. You may want to have other little bonds for companies where you feel it's safer. You can take an equity investment. So there's different forms of investment that are still out there. And the little guy, many little people will be doing it instead of those with privilege. Greater privilege.
Yeah, so, yeah, I think that the interesting thing, the kind of interesting phenomena that, that comes about at this point in time is that in the past, when there was talk about the government creating the money, the threat was inflation, okay? And we can actually see right now that there's so much, quote, room for inflation, if you will, that the criticism has become on the other side, that is to say, well, the government creating money will lead to a recession. And in this regard in particular, and in regard to Dr. Minsky's paper, it is responded to at the Levy Economics Institute in a paper by Dr. Jan Kriegel, in which he challenges Minsky in saying that if we took the reforms of 100% money and we applied them in a more modern context, that the outcome would be a recession or something similar. A lack of capital formation of the economy is how he directly calls it. But he provides no evidence of that. He provides no proof of that. He just offers it as a concern, to get everybody concerned about it. And there's no basis for it. And to that I would say, Dr. Yamaguchi, to that I would say, well, we have modeled, the results of introducing debt-free money into the national economy, and the results are economic growth, greater economic growth, a lack of inflation, a lack of deflation, a lack of public debt, and less private debt. So we have the results modeled, and what do they have? What do they have? They have rhetoric because they're trying to put the fear into the economics profession that if they go for this, they're going to get hung out on the hook of a pending recession. And to me, it's bull.
That's the technical term for it.
I'm going to disagree a couple guys on my left here. This is the answer, guys. This is the big thing, okay? You'll read in my book, there's the three other things, they're minor compared to this one. This is the biggie. Once you have enough money, you can do everything. Money is the key. Money is the major factor. Okay? It's a major factor in economics, it's a major factor in business. And when you increase that money supply and you diversify it in many different areas, both in investment and debt and direct current spending, this is it. This is how we go into space. This is how we colonize the solar system. This is how we eliminate hunger. This is the big one, okay? And until we pass it, we're going to be suffering. And what's going to happen in this robotic world as employment declines, it's going to become very critical that they have enough money so they have quality customers. And when their sales are going down, that's when they'll start doing it. And it's starting in Silicon Valley. They realize that they can't buy their little toys if they don't have a job. And they realize jobs are going away because they're the ones that are creating it to go away. And so this is the answer. This is the biggie. This is not a temporary thing. This is going to take us into the future, okay? As long as the capitalistic system lasts, which will probably last at least another couple hundred years.
This is one of the two biggies, just saying.
Yeah. If I have enough money, I can buy the land.
I think Sue has a question.
I have a question, yes. I'm concerned, I've been concerned about bringing our message to the left and the right, but what I haven't heard being discussed is the small business owner versus the corporation. I'm like everybody in the United States, I see it every day right in front of me. Small businesses going out of business and the large corporations. A friend of mine went up to Maine to talk to local fish farmers, and he found out they're all gone, and there's a multinational corporation that is now there. They're also in Peru, they're also in Scotland. I think that's something major we have to think about when we're analyzing the economy and how money is going to get into the hands of people and how investment is going to be made. So if you could talk to that.
So the thing about that, I feel, okay, is what Minsky said. You know, we have moved towards the concentration of money power and lending power and investment power into the hands of the few banks, okay? And they're making their credit available in larger doses to fewer people. And where the result of that offsetting is smaller, lesser available capital for the small businesses that you're concerned about. So, what did he say? You know, a review of our economic financing and financial structures is in order that we might achieve a more balanced application, if you will, of the available credit to the little people as well as the giants. And we can't get that any other way except for reform, as far as I'm concerned. Maybe that's one of the.
I want to say that I think it's two things actually. I think part of your concern is a function of scarcity, and so when people have less money, I'm going to shop at Walmart. I'm going to try to find the cheapest product I can always find because it benefits me in my personal life. Another part of that is capitalism looks for the most efficient means of production, and so there's a reason why Walmart can buy things cheaper than everything else. When I was younger, I owned a record store, and it was my own business. I had records in there, and well, CDs. It wasn't actually records, so I don't want to date myself that much. It was CDs. And I had opened this store before I had really done some research, because this was actually one of my first businesses I had ever opened. And I was selling my CDs for like, it's probably about $10, right? No, I was selling my CDs for about $13. And I was selling them because when I ordered them, I was ordering them in smaller quantities. So I would order 10 CDs of something that just came out, and I would sell them for $13. I made a couple dollars a CD. Well, what I hadn't done in my research, if I had done my research, I would have never opened this record store. But that's another story. That's why business plans are important. When I went to a Target or a Best Buy, they were selling the same CD for less than what I could buy it for, right? And so while they were selling the CD for $9, and I was paying $10 to resell it. And so a lot of this is just a fact. I think there are laws that can be passed. I think you would get a lot of pushback. I don't care whatever system you're under, because I think once you start impeding on somebody to make deals and make their own contracts, I think you'll always have issues. And so you can pass a law that says if a distributor sells a product, no matter who it's to, it has to be for the same price. And so Walmart, I don't care if you are buying 1 million units, you have to sell it to the same price as somebody who's buying one. You could pass that, you could try. I think you're going to always have difficulties. I think part of it is just progress moves forward. We may not always like it, but I think at some point in time, people are going to make their own decisions about what they want to buy. But I think if we could eliminate scarcity and people trying to budget, if you want to support your small business in your neighborhood, then support your small business. Some people will always choose to go to Walmart to get something a little bit cheaper because that's what they want to do. And so I don't think that's something that should be legislated. I think scarcity is an issue and people should have enough money to spend money the way they choose to spend.
Everybody wants to answer your question, by the way.
Well, I just would like to put it a little bit of different, open up to a different kind of discussion. Mark addressed it briefly.
We want to finish the question first.
It's the
Still
same question, yeah, it's the same question. I mean, we have to remember where the antitrust laws came from to begin with, which was, the turmoil that came out of the 1874 and the 1893 financial panics, which resulted in major.
I think the battery just died. Does anybody have a microphone battery?
Yeah,
This
but-
is this guy over here.
There was a huge amount of concentration that came into all the industries, and there was a major political uprising about it. If you remember your history, particularly the 1890s, there was huge turmoil, and a Republican Congress and a Republican president supported the enactment of antitrust actions to reduce the impact. Because what you lose is, you lose competition when you have monopolies like that. And what's resulted since the 1980s, I think, as Mark also addressed, was a general reluctance to enforce those. I know we had huge debates when I was working with the banking committee in the late 1980s at the same time we were dealing with the S&L crisis. There was this ongoing debate about interstate banking and branching, because at that point there was still limits on the extent to which banks could operate in more than one state. There were huge limits on that. They couldn't. The chink in the wall was the failing S&Ls that were allowed to be purchased by healthy depository institutions, and that's how Citibank began expanding in interstate as well as Chase and a couple of others. It was what became, well, it's at the point. The thing is that I remember Bruce Vento talking very loudly, and Claude Pepper, who was the congressman from Florida and had been in the Congress at that point since he'd been a senator to begin with in the 1940s, lost that, got elected to the House and served there for many, many years. And he was chairman of the Rules Committee. In the House, that's the gatekeeper to what can go to the floor. And he kept interstate banking and branching off the floor of the House single-handedly for quite a few years. In the Banking Committee, there was huge debates about the extent of that, and it was always around the question of how much of the deposit base could be acquired within each state by any single institution. I remember Bruce Vento, congressman then from Minneapolis, subcommittee chair, used to say that the magic number was 7%. There's no single financial institution should be allowed to control more than 7% of the deposit base in any state under the interstate banking and branching. And that didn't quite get in there in 1994 when it got done. But this is, part of, if you can aggregate to the extent that you can control, some percentage, and it'll vary by industry, I think, some percentage of the distribution, you're always going to be able to roll out over the smaller institutions. I mean, you can go around and look now in terms of the deadmall.com, and a website that looks at all the strip malls and shopping malls around the United States that are now dead. I mean, that's the next thing that's dying, because we can't even do all of the shopping in stores anymore because online is taking it over. Anyway, it's a plug for looking at solutions that are already on the books to some extent and have been discussed for the last 125 years in terms of how big can things get before we need to think about limiting it to preserve the polity.
Yeah, I think that the NEED Act solves a lot of that problem that I'm not going to say that there isn't going to be continue to be some consolidation or whatever. But as a former small businessman, and one that just, boy, am I glad that I was not in business when the financial crisis hit in 2008, and I can't see, you know, the pressures on small businesses just to keep their doors open over the last 9 years have been tremendous, and we've lost a lot of small businessmen. But if we pump $3.2 trillion into the American people's hands, they're going to go out and support small businesses. That doesn't mean they're not going to go to Walmart or someplace else too, or whatever it is, but there'll be plenty of money there to support small businesses. And that's the solution. And as my friend Mark Pesch, I'm going to give him the thing, he said that you can't have too much money.
I want to have short answers, but there's a land and a debt issue with small businesses. Big business doesn't have much debt. And although there were exceptions, Chrysler went under. I said, how could a company that's been making cars for 80 years and making good cars for up until the last few years, how could they be going bankrupt? And it's because the banks keep taking everything and then lending it, and they lend it back to bigger companies. So when Enron went under, GE took it over. The other thing is that big companies are labor efficient. Small companies are land and resource efficient. So the full-time family farmer gets much more yield per acre than the agribusiness farmer who has one guy sitting on a giant tractor and just plows the best land, but doesn't do personal attention to anything. Nobody would shop at Walmart if they had money. Rich people don't shop at Walmart now. Poor people shop at Walmart. But when you look at labor or land efficiency, you see that Walmart not only has to have this huge store with this huge parking lot that people have to drive to burning gas that should be taxed, but the small business guy has a tiny store and you get lots of personal service there. You get much better service at a hardware store than you get at Home Depot. So all of these things, big business is labor efficient, small business is land and resource efficient. Big business has their own banks. You know, General Motors has the General Motors Acceptance Corporation, which is GM's bank. Small business has to borrow money to do it, and so do their customers have to use credit cards to buy anything.
I would like to follow up on your comments, Jim. Can you illuminate a little bit the history of why it is that these long-standing antitrust laws have not been applied more vigorously to the banking industry? I understand at some point they got certain exemptions. You know, how come this tradition has kind of been out of the picture?
It's a good question. And it's not one that I have personal experience with other than being in the Congress as it was happening. I mean, it was part of the growing sense that business should be deregulated that began primarily with Reagan as president and continued through with the Clintons. And it was felt that, just like we talked about with Alan Greenspan, that the market knew best, and that if the mergers should happen and they made economic sense, there wasn't any reason to look at it. And so the Justice Department, who has it's also because it's split. Some mergers are reviewed by the Federal Trade Commission and some by the Justice Department, and some they have to do together. And there was a sense that, I had that sense with the bank examiners too. I mean, bank examination made almost a U-turn in the 1980s. Where the old-time examiners were strict and rigid, and bankers feared them coming in. And from the 80s on, when bank examiners went into a bank, the the banking management felt like they owned them, and they could dictate the terms to the bank examiner when it came in. And it was, to some extent, I think there was some of that also, that there was intimidation of the ones who were making the decision, because after all, they were just anonymous government employees. And there was also the sense that there was a shift into allowing, that there must be some economic sense for this, and it wasn't going to be the government second guessing what the private sector thought was best for the economy.
I'll make a short answer. It's in my section 3 of my book. If you don't have antitrust or regulation, the marketplace will basically cease to exist, and it'll be down into a monopoly at best, an oligopoly. And so you have to have, so we need to expand the antitrust. In Europe, they call it, as you know, the Competitive Commission. And so I think we should change the name to Competitive Commission. And we need to really expand the research, the economists, the lawyers in that department, because they've really consolidated the business. They don't understand definitions. For instance, United Healthcare insures everybody in Mississippi, all the chicken farmers in Mississippi. You know, so it's a monopoly in that particular area, and we really have to take a look. The chicken farmers are owned by, what, one firm in 4 states or something? And things like that. So it's an area that's tricky, needs to be studied, researched, and implemented.
And antitrust does apply to banks. We saw a lot of that in this last thing, and the argument, the banks usually got their way because the argument was, this bank is failing, I'm taking them over. So National Bank of Cleveland got bought out by PNC Bank, which is a merger of Pittsburgh National Bank and Provident Bank of Philadelphia. But the other scandal in that was that these big banks were taking over the small banks with bailout money that we gave to the big banks. So there's 2 scandals. One is why we bail out large corporations instead of bailing out the homeowners who couldn't pay their mortgage. The only reason the banks were going under is that we were going under.
Yeah.
And if they'd have bailed us out, the banks would have been fine.
They would have got all the money.
Yeah, they would have got the money anyhow, and we'd still have our homes.
Yeah, right.
It's logic.
Yes, the mic.
Well, I had been giving a lot of thought to Sue's question over the years recently. And that my thinking about this was, with the NEAT Act solution, that large corporations would begin to shrink. And this is because they wouldn't have that line of credit that they now have, that is like unlimited practically. And that the small businesses who would be getting money because we're putting money in at the floor of the economy would be doing great, and that the big corporations would begin to shrink.
I don't think so.
Do you think, you don't think so?
A little bit maybe, but not a significant factor.
I think so. When you look at the efficiency of small business versus big businesses' corporate advantages are almost entirely an artifact of taxation. So whether you use the issue of new money to replace payroll taxes, because payroll taxes hurt small business. Small business has a higher ratio of payroll to profit. Whatever you do that's fundamentally just will give small businesses an advantage, because when you take out the tax anomalies, they are actually more efficient.
I kind of agree more with Mark Pass on this. I don't think you're going to eliminate large corporations. I believe in antitrust and all that, but with growing populations, a global economy, big businesses are actually needed. There's no way that you can get the efficiencies of an Amazon and drones delivering stuff without having the capital to invest in stuff like that. Most of the technologies you see today would not be around if it wasn't for large businesses, because a small business does not have the capital or the research capacity to do this type of stuff. If you looked at the amount of money that goes into research and development of large companies, there's no way a small business is going to necessarily be able to do that. And this goes back to a libertarian principle of individual choice. Let people decide what they want to do. Now, granted, you do have to have antitrust laws to make sure that businesses don't get into too many areas, and I'm fine with segmenting businesses. But if competition allows you to be big, then competition allows you to be big. If most people want to go to that business, should government be in the business of stopping that? Should we say, no, don't go to that business, we want you to go to this one because it's a little bit smaller, if I like this one? Personal service aside, you said Home Depot. I love Home Depot. I get great service at Home Depot. They all have little things, they cut my wood for me, they do everything. So I like them, but that's me and that's you, and to me, that's what individual liberty is about, is being able to choose where you want to go. And so if you want to go to a small business, there are plenty of people like you. There are plenty of people like Sue who love South. There are enough people out there to keep them in business, and without scarcity, I think that's an issue. I wouldn't focus too much on worrying about limiting corporation size. You do have to do it from a Communist Manifesto standpoint. Right, you have to worry about it in that context. But companies are going to get larger. There are 7 million people on earth right now. Mark said it's going to round off around 10. There are going to be large, very large companies. They have capital. I think Apple has $100 billion in the bank in cash. They're going to do what they want to do. You can't stop them. They're going to be there. So.
The key is in competition to small businesses.
Get the microphone.
Is how big does Amazon get? They control already probably half of the online market, and they're getting bigger. And so you have an analysis of, is it a monopoly? It's definitely an oligopoly. And those are the type of things that need to be studied and researched.
But didn't I hear earlier that
You need a
Google
mic.
and large
Wait for
companies...
the mic.
But didn't I hear earlier that Google and large companies depend on government money for their research
A lot of it does, yeah.
to begin? I see.
Yeah, the
When
risk
they're
capital.
small, I got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like the internet startup.
Right.
Yeah.
I'd like to mention another example. When we were pushing for the NEAT Act in Washington DC, Elizabeth Kucinich had us come over and join her for Pig Biz. And Pig Biz was an afternoon or an evening where we learned about the European Union using its banking power to give a large corporation, Stonyfield, the right to go into Poland and buy out a huge communal farm and make it a super ag pig business, where pigs are living on top of each other and the whole 9 yards. And the Polish people in the neighborhood had a revolt. They were just totally upset at what was going on, and this was against, too, the organic movement. And in the wisdom of the banks, they said, gee, the price of pig is coming down, and we can maybe increase. So they went to Romania and did the same thing, but they upset the local population. So there's a natural give and take, or a back and forth, but it may be a push for healthier pigs over more land, less antibiotics. So there's going to be a fight there, and we'll have to make those decisions going forward.
Let me try to add something to your observation there, Howard, which to me does indicate a movement in the lessening of the size of the corporations, and it's about capital formation. It has to do with the fact that if the companies will move of all sizes will move to more financing themselves on retained earnings and less borrowing. Because why? Because the borrowing is going to be done with real money. That means somebody has to put real money at risk that is going to take the place of having the bank's ability to create all money by lending it, and to me that is going to and so then it's a matter of, so where does the bank, where the ones that are borrowing the money get the money, and up to the depositors, to be putting their money in a bank that they believe in. So my take on it is that is going to have a a lessening impact on the ability of companies to grow themselves into being, you know, super duper size. That the fact that they're going to have to borrow real money and put somebody's real money at risk, as opposed to collateralizing, you know, their future. There'll still be collateral, but it will be based on real money borrowings, and I think that will change things.
It's a little bit more than that, because if a corporation, any business, small, medium, large, borrows, they get to deduct it. But if they get investment, the dividends are not tax deductible. That's why besides availability, like Joe says, that's why they always borrow. And what's happened with the decline in the money and maybe a little change in the tax system, they'll start getting more equity fund, and you want more equity, because that's much safer. They don't have debt service, and you know, they're talking like the banks invest, but there'll be other investment people, like in my industry, out there gathering all this extra money in mutual funds and investment companies and all sorts of things for equity and debt investment. So there'll be plenty of alternatives.
If I may go to a different tack here.
Sure.
I have a question for Mr. Giovanni. So the Minsky paper, that sounds really interesting. I'm going to read it. I actually just looked it up at Google Scholar to see how many citations it had. I was a little disappointed. It was only 61, and Ray is quite often in that.
Right.
I was wondering, just to figure out if Minsky is so important, and this paper for us is so important, would you look into those citations and maybe find other papers that might be in harmony with it or refuting it, to assess something like, well, what is the impact of this paper? Maybe find natural allies that we don't know about. There might be papers there saying like, whoa, this is great, you know, but we don't know about these academics that are there. The same thing I would like to do, actually, I haven't done that for a while, is there are websites like academia.edu and ResearchGate, where we can find out how much, you know, Zarlenga has been cited, or Kumhoff, etc. And that it might be something of a tool to, you know, find a different field where we might find allies. So I know that you know this, and you're very enthusiastic about this paper, so you would be the one to find out, you know, are these citations, you know, is there something fruitful in there?
Yeah, thanks. You know, this kind of goes back to how I started my talk, which was, we don't study the monetary system, you know, and you know, there's a great video with Bernard Lietaer saying that how he when he met Paul Krugman as a young man, and he asked him, you know, what he was studying, what he was planning to study, and Krugman told him that he had intended to study money and the monetary system, but his academic advisor told him, if you want to advance in this field, you will not study the money. You will not study money. You will not study the monetary system. There will be no Nobel for the monetary system, and there will be no Nobel. There will be no you know, academic advancement for you if you decide to study the money system. And so, to me, that's the reality that we're dealing with, and that's one of the things to me that makes, because even though, as you could see, even Minsky had to couch it in terms of the banking system. You know, occasionally in there you saw 2 or 3 citations, which was the money and banking system, but to me that would be, you know, like, why? Well, how can modern monetary theory ignore this paper? How can they ignore, you know, this presentation? And the answer is easily. And in fact, what did they do besides? Because you're right about Ray. Besides Jan Kragel's paper, in which he explained that, you know, I think the great Hyman Minsky. And by the way, he's the senior Minsky scholar at the Levy Economics Institute, Dr. Kregel is. And he had to go on there and criticize, Dr. Minsky for stepping out so far as to say that reform might be in the air, And then you take that to the other side, which another paper that I could use to give a talk about, which is Dr. Friedman's paper from 1948 on the monetary and fiscal framework, again, for economic stability. And so you see that there's a theme there, stability in the economy, which is what we really want. Even Mark wants that, I'm sure, both wants that. But the fact of the matter is that Randy Wray had to then turn around and do a paper in which he attacked Milton Friedman, for saying that the way to achieve economic stability is to do what we're proposing to do, is to move to a sovereign fiat money system of government issuance directly. Milton Friedman, I mean, it should be plain vanilla, middle of the road stuff, but no, immediately he started getting attacked, and even to this day he gets attacked for that. He's dead buried, but still they come out, because they don't want to, honestly, I'm gonna say it, the economists don't want to see it out there as something that they have to deal with. That's something that, if a student comes up and says, well, what about monetary reform? I wish Nick Tiedemann was here, because is Nick Tiedemann here?
He'll be here tomorrow.
Because it's like this is blasphemy, in the economic religion. But I will take you up on that, and I will try to ascertain, further, than what you have done there. But thank you.
That was another parallel between land and money, because the three factors of production, if you take economics, you'll learn right at the beginning the three factors of production are land, labor, and capital. And then you'll never hear about land again. And the economists also tell you, like Milton Friedman, actually, who endorsed both land value tax and fiat money, told Nick Tiedemann that he doesn't like to talk about land value tax because his constituency is conservatives and they hate it. So you have this, everything's polarized into left and right, and we're in the middle, where there's the polarizers, the power brokers, and the problem solvers, and we're the problem solvers, and the power brokers don't like us because usually the solution takes away some of their ability to broker power. And the polarizers don't like us because they'd rather fight with each other than solve anything. So all these issues that are fundamentally right antagonize the power structure.
Well said.
Yeah, I have three questions. I will only ask two, and the first one is actually asking the rest of the panel just to address if you have a comment, the question that I asked Mark before about whether there is any need or actually whether it might even be counterproductive for the purposes that we're all working towards in monetary reform to have insurance still needed on checking accounts and/or savings accounts. So that's one question. The other one is around the question of taxation. And I agree with Mark and many other people who, after the reform, the NEED Act, so much will be possible to do in terms of meeting the commercial needs of the society and the public good, the social good. But my perspective, and so I'm just asking for your comments on this, that there would still remain two purposes for taxation after, the Reform Act. And the one is a secondary purpose, I'll say that secondly, but the first one to me seems there's still being a need for checks and balances, for taxation to pay for the internal work of government, the paying the lights and the heat bill of the Congress, paying the legislators, paying the internal work of government for transparency reasons, for the checks and balances that the citizens have for the expenditure of government, so that government, for its own internal work, is not living high off the hog in comparison, sort of, or just doing it willy-nilly, and that the citizens have sort of a checks and balances on that. Where that money comes from to begin with is largely spending the money into circulation. It came from the public sovereign money to begin with, but there's a checks and balances. And the secondary purpose of taxation would be for monetary policy, and that when there's way too much money in savings and banks can't give it away, and so then it's inflationary, and the prices are going to go up, and to keep, that's what the second part of the constitutional piece there is, that they regulate or monitor the value thereof. And so money is simply taxed out of existence to keep prices stable, or maybe lowering over time.
I think we got the questions.
What?
I think we got the two
Okay.
questions.
Thank you.
I'll take a couple of them. I think your first question, well, I'll start with your last question first. Go ahead. I'm sorry. I think the last question which goes to how money is, well, let me take the first one. The first one is transparency, which to me, I'll use an example. We pay taxes now, we pay a lot of taxes now, and the military regularly reports that they can't find $1 trillion. So I don't know that taxes necessarily promote transparency. I think transparency promotes transparency. Whether or not it comes from taxes or whether or not it comes from the government creating sovereign money, I think it's just a question. For me personally, I look at it as though if you can create your own money, don't ask me for anything. That's just how I look at taxes. Now, that does not mean that I don't support taxes at some level. I support taxes for military spending because I do think that provides checks and balances on the government so that they don't go crazy. And the people have a way of accounting for a military that may be growing too fast. So I think that's a valid use of taxation is the military, and there are some other valid uses. I don't know if you necessarily need it for the lights and stuff like that. I think what they pay, I think is transparent. It can be shown